Welcome to panel 2 in our track. And this panel is called Rethinking. And this is where we're going to be seeing and mapping what is happening in society today. The first panel focused on who are we and why are we. This panel will focus on, excuse me, where are we today? I'd like to start off with a story, actually, that I found, excuse me, that I found recently. It was an article in a book that's coming out. The title of the book is When Democracy Breaks. And this story goes all the way back to Athens, Greece, the first democracy in the world. And scholars over the years have been focused on what caused democracy to slide in Athens. What were the many reasons? Well, the authors of this book really took a much deeper dive into that question. And I am interested in that question because there may be lessons here for where we are today. So the normal culprits, wars, the people within the democracy who really didn't like the democracy were all factors that became very important in the decline over 180 some odd years. This is a democracy that lasted almost 200 years. But looking at that deeper dive, in fact, what the authors really understood was that in addition to the drain on resources that the wars in particular, had an effect on, there was a crisis of legitimacy. And this wasn't just at one point in time. It took place over, obviously, the years, but a real crisis of legitimacy. And some of the contributions and the manifestations to that crisis were things like the actual design of their democracy. The democracy, remember, this is the first time, this is an experiment too, but they did not have a system of checks and balances. They had an assembly which made decisions. The problem was nobody was keeping track of the decisions and what those decisions meant for the population. And over a period of time too, the leadership was not responding to what the needs of the society were. And people actually understood this. And they also figured, we put our time and effort into this democracy because we expect something to come back. They saw inequalities there. They were not getting back what they were putting into their democracy. The one interesting thing about this history in Athens was indeed their democracy did decline. However, it was revitalized. And how did it revitalize itself? Well, again, people did like the idea of the democracy, but what they recognized was we need to take what worked in our old democracy and we need to bring in some new ideas and modifications, et cetera, in order to go forward. So that's what they did. That's the story about Athens. And of course, the last part of the story relating to Athens is that they were simply taken over by a much larger country. So it's not the point of the ending of the democracy. The whole notion of democracy has continued down through the hundreds of years since then. But nonetheless, this is the experience that is depicted in this particular book, When Democracy Breaks. So I wanted to share that with you. Okay, if we can go ahead. So where are we today in our democracy? Aha, crumble picture, we the people. This is how many people think about where we are today. Our Constitution doesn't seem to be holding up. More importantly, our whole system doesn't seem to be holding up. And that's reflected in many different ways. I mean, when you think about what the conversation is today about democracy, what are people saying? What are the polls saying? What is the research saying? So The Economist has a really good index on democracy. And they have pointed out that the US democracy has been downgraded 3 times since 2016. I think they put out this index, if I'm not mistaken, every 2 years. But same criteria that Butch talked about, et cetera. So we've been downgraded a couple of times now. And the first time was, yes, the US has free elections. However, they're not fair. What did that mean? Okay, Congress and the CIA recognized that the Russians had an undue influence in that 2016 election with all of their hacking, with all of their, excuse me, use of social media and what have you. I won't go down through every single downgrade, et cetera, but the last one was 2019. Congress simply made a request about the White House's refusal to comply with their request for information. It was never delivered. So that created another downgrading. Yeah. All right. If you do this too quickly. Okay, what are the people saying about democracy? Okay, first of all, again, you know, there's the research, but also what are people saying in the polls? And remember, keeping in mind, of course, the polls are one slice in time, and they change all the time too. But there seems to be some consistency. Pride in democracy in particular seems to be down quite a bit. Pride in our democracy. So people are not thinking about democracy as they had maybe 50 years ago. They're also saying, we think however we define democracy individually, however we think about it, we do think that it's in danger of collapse. So for whatever reason, they're also saying Pew Center poll. A lot of people, too many people don't think that we are any longer a model of democracy, not just in this country, but for the whole world. And of course, these polls have to be looked at carefully too. You have to find out what the follow-up questions are too. What do people mean by these statements? And finally, you know, this is part of some of the conclusions here from the polling. US government has been losing its ability to govern and its sense of democratic responsibility and lacks the effective measures to push forward the reforms that are needed. This harkens back to Athens and what was happening in Athens in their crisis of legitimacy too. Same types of things happening here, or perceptions. So again, where are we? There's a new word out there. It's called omnishambles. Fairly new word, 2009, I think. I'm just going to focus on the last definition here. The founding generation of the American experiment responded to the toxicity of colonialism by understanding how the social, cultural, and ideogenic construct of our models of reality. Okay, so it's more than poor judgment. It's developing policy, conducting governance, and thinking that ignores the invisible dynamics of the living system of nature and the viability of its institutions and, viability of its institutions, and most importantly, pathological and change in both the invisible culture genetic and ideogenetic environments. Lots of big words, et cetera, but the point is poor judgment in developing policy, conducting governance, and thinking that ignores the invisible dynamics of living systems. Okay. Our history has not been an easy one. The journey has been very, very hard. And in this slide, I just point out not all, but many of the national conversations that this country has had. These were conversations that indeed, in some way, transformed not only governance, but the government paradigm in terms of how people thought about governing and our government too. Obviously, the American Revolution was a total flipping of the script. We went from kings, queens, popes, etc., being at the top of the pyramid. Instead, citizens became the most important group of people in our democracy. Not any other type of leader, but the citizens themselves, we the people. Civil war, conversation by other means, another national conversation. By the way, when I talk about national conversation, I'm not talking about people getting together in the same room at the same time or in the states, et cetera. Certainly some of that took place, but it took place in a variety of places, in homes, in pubs, in inns and what have you, in the newspapers. The conversation played out in the newspapers too. For the Civil War, the Atlantic Monthly started publishing in 1858. They were one of the leaders in reflecting the sides of the Civil War question too. So that's also how conversations play out. And Great Depression, major change in our society, major. And of course, we're still, civil rights, we're still working on that. The point about these conversations though, not all of them or any of them, in fact, settled an issue. But they were stepping stones to continue settling the issue. Going back to the American Revolution, women did not have voting rights in our Constitution originally. Okay, 1858, they said, it's time for us. We need our turn too. And it took until 1918, 1919 for women to get the vote. But during that period of time, women organized themselves locally, regionally, statewide to identify the issue and to marshal their forces. We were fighting an uphill battle, but we fought it and we got the vote in the 1900s. So not everything is settled immediately with these national conversations. Hopefully, the Forum on Democracy will be presenting the ideas for a national conversation of change going forward, because we're up for another conversation. Okay, I think I'm going to end there. And Axiomaps. We have the next speaker today is going to be David Apgar, and he's joining us remotely. And David is going to be talking about, excuse me, why we can no longer seem to agree on facts. It's a big problem. It's called polarization, in part, many different faces to this. But what he will talk about are the preconditions for factual agreement that are missing today, and perhaps some ideas on what we can do about it. So David, are you ready?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Let me see if I can share my screen.
Okay.
So what I'm going to do is to read some excerpts from a forthcoming book called Why We Can No Longer Agree on Facts. Rauman and Littlefield's Lexington imprint. They're actually in the capital area. We'll be putting it out next year. And I should just briefly introduce myself so you know why I wrote this. And I also like to just say a word or two about how I think it bears on the rest of the sessions today for the Democracy Forum. So my name is David Apgar. The last name is a little odd, but if for those of you who've had newborns, it's the same as the name of the test, which is named for a distant relative who ran pediatrics in the March of Dimes until she died in the 1970s. And the book really is a result of the collision of my two careers. I don't know if I should really call them careers, but in recent years, I've focused on development economics, and I've been a fund manager and worked in places like Nepal, Lebanon, and Haiti. Essentially, I've lived and worked in states that were failing. And the other part of my career in the 20 or so years before that, I really focused on investigating risk, how data affect our learning speed, and how and what are the elements of predictive power. Broadly, how facts arise, and that was across a number of different positions. As a writer, I wrote several business texts on risk. As a software designer, as an advisor, I was Bill Bradley's staff economist. I was an advisor in the U.S. Treasury quite a while ago, and I was a research director at Corporate Executive Board, and as an adjunct professor. And seeing the connection between the ideas from that earlier part of my working life and the inability to agree on basic facts that is immiserating countries today. That was a late in life revelation. That's the reason for the book. So I'm going to read fairly quickly. The slides are simple. I apologize for that, but I want to try to keep us on track. So I'm calling these excerpts "What to Do About Belief Segregation." Oh, one more thing. How does this bear on the rest of our talks? There's really two reasons I wanted to take advantage of this opportunity from Val and Lowell. One is that these excerpts are sort of a wake-up call. They're somewhat pessimistic, maybe too pessimistic, about national democracy, to the point where it says maybe we should be focusing on what we can do to shore up democracy within the borders of individual states. The other reason is that I think the next two sections of the forum's presentations today are going to be talking about how citizen action is required to revitalize democracy. These remarks have to do with what citizen action requires, so we need to pay attention to that as well. All right, a look back at 20th century breakthroughs in how we determine facts reveals why the belief segregation underway in the US may be irreversible. It's not because a 20th century intellectual elite working in physics, psychology, semantics, and much else undermined objective knowledge. It's because factual agreement between groups turns out to be impossible without shared projects or other meaningful interaction. And a large part of American society has insulated itself from the rest. If this is right, states may have to go their own way to varying extents. And Val, can you hear me okay? I just want to make sure this is coming through.
Yes, but David, did you already change the slide? Because
Not
we
yet.
are seeing. Oh, okay. Sorry for that.
Yeah, but let me know in a couple minutes. So the thesis of the book: 3 turning points in 20th century philosophy show that widespread factual agreement requires a pervasive habit of checking assumptions, densely connected communities, and projects that straddle those communities. But these are requirements for factual agreement to be possible at all. That's why their fragility matters so much. Magical thinking, isolation, and group insularity all block it. Well, briefly, the fervent early 20th century focus on observational data in physics, logic, and psychology provoked a pretty fierce backlash. Karl Popper protested that we use observations to weed out wrong theories so we can focus on the ones that stand up to harsh tests. In other words, we don't use observations to prove theories. His approach, called fallibilism, shows that broad factual agreement requires not so much shared facts as a pervasive habit of error testing and assumption testing. Wittgenstein's revolution, remember him, on the social nature of language, shows our ability to determine facts in isolation has surprising limits. It turns out isolated speakers can't always tell whether they're using new language consistently. So isolation limits what people can learn and remember. But if our best scientific theories rest on some sort of social consensus, then aren't the facts they bring to light somehow relative to time, place, and maybe culture? Indeed, that might have been the end of the story. Theoretical breakthroughs nourishing a relativism regarding facts that conservative thinkers feared at the time, liberals embraced, and conservative media eventually deployed to transform democratic politics. But Donald Davidson's 1970s advance in radical translation showed facts really are independent of theories, since you can always reconcile the facts supporting any two well-tested theories. It also shows independent groups cannot build a base of agreed facts unless they share projects with common goals. Now, you might think members of two groups will understand one another as long as they can talk about situations both groups share, but only if they keep track of shifting priorities and attitudes as well. Without interaction, groups lose ways of telling whether they really agree on what they see and hear, regardless of the language they use. Beliefs become segregated, even where both groups are densely connected communities of critical thinkers, that is to say, assumption checkers. A short list of countries suffering from this kind of belief segregation includes Afghanistan, Bosnia. Sorry, I did miss a slide. A short list of countries that suffering from this kind of belief segregation includes Afghanistan, Bosnia, Haiti, Lebanon, Mali, Nepal. Always seems to be the places where I've worked. The United Kingdom, the United States, and Yemen. Some are failing. Even the rich ones are struggling. Beliefs about the purpose of the state split them, whether it's to serve God, the interests of an ethnic or religious group, an elite, or a class with a special claim to legitimacy. Might have been part of the problem in Athens. Together, they show the fragility of the assumption testing, community density, and shared projects that make civil agreement possible. Now, so this slide makes the point that assumption testing, densely connected communities, and shared projects are requirements for agreement. Did the slide change? Have these two slide changes worked?
Yes.
Yep, yes.
Great. All right. So that's the background of the book. Let's race up to the present. The news here is that these are requirements or preconditions for agreement. In other words, a refusal to question assumptions, which I call magical thinking, the first box here. Individual isolation, failure of the second assumption, and group insularity will each eventually block it. Belief segregation is the result. Belief segregation is the result. How irreversible is it? Well, plenty of theories try to explain the growing inability of Americans to agree on facts about public health, climate change, election results, pregnancy, gun violence, and much else. A common one blames anger at the abrupt rise in the country's income and wealth inequality after 1980, really from levels of Scandinavia to those of Asian and African dictatorships. It's compelling. It's a compelling theory because the effect on older Midwestern industrial cities has been so grim, and the amount of the overall transfers has been so large. A transfer to the top 1% of earners from the lower 90% of nearly their entire 1980 share of total income growth over the period. Staggering. This is data from RAND Corporation. If the median full-time worker's income had grown as fast as the economy since 1980, it would have been $92,000 rather than $50,000 in 2018, which begs the question whether economic reform might stop the unraveling. Well, it's not hard to imagine a few reforms that could restore workers' fair share of income growth. Aggressive antitrust enforcement aimed at injecting competition back into business sectors like airlines, payments, telecoms, insurance for one. That's something, by the way, that's now popular in both parties. And taxing unearned income as heavily as earned income for another. Ironically, a lost principle of Ronald Reagan's 1986 tax reform. So these are practical proposals with bipartisan appeal. In other words, that could weaken both monopolies as a source of income concentration and the tax code as a vehicle for widening inequality. Could they quell the anger? Let's assume they could, and the resulting boost to working families was eventually enough to unhook Americans from conspiracy theories, enough even to rebuild the pragmatism that's been the traditional American form of assumption testing, our first requirement for widespread factual agreement to be possible at all. Would the capacity to agree on facts recover? And the problem, of course, is that these are all requirements, and there are two more. Densely connected communities, the second requirement, would still be missing in many parts of the US. Now, of course, there's little you can do about geography, given that the US is one of the most sparsely populated large countries in the world. But, census data shows that rural centers are growing into towns, creating concentrations of people in remote areas. At the same time, social media seem to be isolating kids more than connecting them. That's the problem. essentially recreating the problem of isolation, even in big cities. For the sake of argument, though, let's assume that today's parents find better ways to pry kids off their screens and stay away from the things themselves. With focus and luck, maybe Americans could strengthen each of the first two requirements for widespread agreement.
David, just an interruption. Some people are having a hard time with the audio. Can you slow down just a little bit?
Yes,
Thank you.
sorry about that. I want to be time conscious. There's lots of good stuff to come.
By the way, David, you have, just mentioning time, you have 4 more minutes.
Okay, so given the extent that some of the country's larger politically oriented communities have walled themselves off from the rest, which blocks the third requirement for widespread factual agreement, why should they stop? Why would today's groups stop preferring their own churches, their own clubs and civic groups, their own retirement communities, their own sports, their own schools? Why would they stop preferring the different kinds of housing and architecture? Different settlement sizes, densities, configurations, different kinds of news and other entertainment, different business sectors, and even different management styles. The news here is that these are requirements or preconditions for agreement. In other words, a refusal to question assumption, even in the best case for, let me just skip ahead, even in the best case for economic reform, reinvigorated critical thinking. And where demographic changes in rural areas and adaptation to social media built better connected communities. Even then, there's no reason to think some of today's politically salient communities would stop insulating themselves from the rest. And group insularity is by itself enough to block factual agreement across groups. This has grave implications that few want to face. It means belief segregation would probably keep getting worse at this point, even if Americans found a policy mix that made everyone happy and eased the country's crises of individual isolation. Group insularity has no obvious reverse gear. And this has been a recipe, as I said before, for failing states, and not just in Nepal, Lebanon, and Haiti. The difference in the US is precisely its 50 states. If belief segregation reaches a point where a defeated candidate for high national office refuses to go quietly into the night, and that could well happen next year, US states have the administrative apparatus to manage their own affairs until consensus can be reestablished. In practical terms, this means a state disturbed by a lurched or appointed government at the federal level could temporarily retain the federal tax payments of its citizens. It would need to pay out their federal retirement, Medicaid, and unemployment checks in the meantime, which accounts for 3/4 of federal revenue and spending. Almost all the rest goes to defense and diplomacy, which states could still pass along to Washington, D.C. Now, bloggers hate this line of thought because it's undramatic. You get more clicks and controversy by writing about secession or civil war. But it's worth raising precisely because the turning points we've surveyed suggest practical steps states could take to stem belief segregation within their borders. And that will be especially important if states become more independent. All of which makes it important to talk about democratic community building at the state level, especially if you want to reinvigorate citizen action, to reinvigorate democracy more broadly. What steps do the requirements for factual agreements suggest for a state trying to fight belief segregation? This is really the end of my presentation. I'm just going to tick through the 5 items on this slide. The State House there is in Sacramento. The state may want to convene a conference of churches to encourage some level of community across denominations. Funding clubs and civic groups and supporting unions becomes a greater public priority, given the risks of group insularity and the benefits of keeping people in touch with one another. Widening public school enrollment by making schools as accessible and attractive as possible becomes a top priority if the state wants to avoid the divisions sowing discord in the country as a whole. This means not just increasing state funding for schools, but also finding incentives for localities to increase it beyond their borders. Probably also means significant increases in teacher pay and school options. States could establish a universal statewide service, requiring all men and women to spend a year between the ages of 18 and 25 participating in public works or social service projects along the lines of the French National Service. And finally, ranked choice voting appears to be promoting consensus candidates in Alaska, Maine, and Nevada. by taking voters' second and third choices into account. It weakens the value of belief segregation as a political tool. So these suggestions focus on the third requirement for widespread factual agreement, meaningful interaction across groups, where states need to look after the first two requirements as well. And they may be in a better position than the federal government to strengthen community connectedness, the second one, through initiatives like rural outreach, online gaming guidelines, and social services for families with kids at risk of isolation. If anger and economic stress are behind the turn to magical thinking and conspiracies, though, states have few levers to pull to alleviate it, unless, of course, a political rupture really does lead some of them to take control of their own tax and antitrust policy.
David, one
Lacking
more
those
minute.
tools-
David, one more minute.
Lacking those tools as it is, states can ironically do little to avoid such a rupture, even though they would have the power to deal with one if it should ever occur.
Thank you. Thank you very much. David, I
Let me
know.
stop sharing.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. Okay, let me see here.
Did I
Okay,
really finish on time?
pardon, we're ready for this, okay. The axiomaps too. Just a bit of a change of pace here. This panel is about seeing and mapping. And I'm going to describe a tool that we're experimenting with in order to map what has been happening to the American experiment in the last 70 years. What is AXIMAP? It's a short term for accident map. And this is a technique that's systems-based, and it analyzes the causes of accidents in complex systems. Very interesting, the history. It was originally developed to manage risk in the financial sector by Jens Rasmussen. This was in the 1990s, manage risk. But today, it has evolved to really be a tool for, again, accident analysis, and particularly in the aerospace industry. When there's an accident, plane goes down, et cetera, this is one of the techniques that are being used to analyze why did that happen? Why did that train go off the tracks? So very, extremely obviously useful, not just to analyze, but it also helps to prevent those future types of accidents. So what is the method that they use? How do they identify the contributing factors? And again, I'm talking about right now how it has been used before I start talking about how we're trying to use it, et cetera. But it looks at the factors which contributed to that accident, but at several different levels of the system. And they, the specialists in this arrange those factors in what's called a causal diagram. So you can see not only here are the factors, but how did the factors interact with each other to get to that accident? So it goes beyond, by the way, the very immediate causes like, okay, somebody put their foot on the wrong pedal and that's why the train went off the track. But it looks at all of the contributions going up to the very, very top. So anyway, let's see if I can get the next one here. Okay, let's go one more. I really didn't want to, overwhelm people with what a real accident map looks like. But this is a blank one, obviously, and you can see the levels there. Starting at the very bottom, what was the state of the equipment, going up to operations, going up to the company's management, going all the way up to government policies that may have affected this. But you'll notice too that within every single level, other activity was going on, other relationships with people, other organizations, et cetera. So there's a story behind the story of each one of those levels. Okay, how did we become interested in AXIMAP? We had a presentation about how this was used, not in industries, But indeed, with respect to how the World Health Organization actually dropped the ball in terms of the COVID crisis and how they did not come out on time with the statement that we are in a pandemic, et cetera. I'm not going to go through all of the different things, all the different levels that were analyzed with respect to WHO. But again, different kinds of levels. Level 1, by the way, WHO, the World Health Organization, is a multi-layer organization. It has relationships with many organizations, vertically, horizontally, all those types of things. So it was a really complex application of AxiMaps. And by the way, this was one of the few times that AxiMaps was used outside of very specific industries like aerospace, railroads, et cetera. So next, okay. What we did after hearing this presentation about WHO, we posed the question, can we use this approach to map the last 70 years of what's been happening in our society? And the only reason we talk about those 70 years is starting with the 60s in particular, we had many, not only crises, but perturbations, over the years, et cetera, that really challenged our democracy. And many trends were going on at the same time. So anyway, great turbulence, strides forward, as well as the whole impact of the baby boom generation too, because certainly that generation had an impact on many of the trends that were transpiring during this time. So we're looking at trends and events, not trends and events, not one or the other, but both. What's a trend? What's a demographic trend? Demographic trend after World War II is women staying in the workforce. What implications did that have for family, for work, child rearing, all that type of thing? But in addition, the levels that AxiMap traditionally uses are not really applicable to a democracy. So we decided to do our analysis on 2 levels. One, of course, are the trends and events, but the other is what is the environment, the meta level in which all of this was taking place. Now, this is an experiment, a project in process. We have not finished this yet, but I just wanted to give you a feel for how the Forum on Democracy is approaching this. So these are some of the major trends that we've identified. This is, by the way, not the last iteration of these trends. We are still identifying trends. But for example, how did the media change? And what were the implications of the media going from radio, television, et cetera, to the internet, to World Wide Web, et cetera? What did that do? The challenge in every single one of these, by the way, is not necessarily the trend itself, but trying to do the backstory on the trend. What were some of the things that were happening within that trend? And how did they connect not only to that one trend, but to every other trend? This is a big project. So this is why we have not finished it yet. But just for example, also institutional trust in government changing. This is when we really started to have a little bit of a focus on trust in government. And while this event may not have been the catalyst for trust, it certainly was a contributing factor. And that's the Vietnam War. When people recognized, oh, wait a minute, we're not getting the whole story on Vietnam. The government is not letting the media they're controlling the media in Vietnam. So we're not getting all of the facts. And by the way, Vietnam, I should say this too, Vietnam was preceded with some other issues related to trust. And some of those were actual events: the assassination of John Kennedy, the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy. And people during those times may not have said, well, some people said, we're not concerned about a conspiracy, but it became very clear that something was not right in terms of what we understood about all the information about those assassinations in particular. Now, I'm just focusing on assassinations, but that's when people started to think about, are we getting the full story? If you've ever read the Warren Commission report, which was done very, very quickly in less than a year, there are things that don't make sense there. They don't connect. So people, looking at that, and it's not that people were up in arms, but it just left an idea in their mind that maybe the story isn't the whole story. The Warren Commission report may not have been the last piece on this. But I mentioned that, and then again, following that, the Vietnam War, when we really started to understand, wait a minute, something is not working here. Why are we not being given the full story on this? So I just wanted to give you a flavor. So these are the trend lines that we're looking at, and we're now developing the backstory behind those trend lines. The challenge for all of this, and it is an experiment that we're doing here, the challenge for all this is to really understand the interconnections. We may not be very successful at that. We may be somewhat successful at that. But the point is, what were the interrelationships among these trends that got us, unfortunately, to perhaps where we are today? So I wanted to share that piece with you. And that's the end of my talking about AXI maps, because we haven't finished it yet. But now I'd like to take and turn this panel over to Eve Pinsker and to Daniel Wolk for their presentation. Okay. Yeah, my step out of the way, Peter. No, I'm just going to switch everything to that bench. Oh, thank you. Okay, thank you. Thank you. See, I don't want to use up
One of
your
the things
time.
we're gonna be doing
Your
is
time.
trying to create a Ken Burns type event out of this that allows Americans to see how they became who we are now. And so this is a different form of journalism of the ideas and realities that have produced where we are now, which is really gonna be dealing with the next
You have
panel
to,
of where are we and where we're going.
so Dan, you have to press. It's not easy to use.
You start, right?
Well, what about you press for me and then I'll press for you, okay?
That sounds good to me.
All right.
So introduce yourself.
Yeah, we will. Hang on.
Okay. Need the
Okay,
new-
so okay. Oh, huh. So I'm Eve Pinsker and this is Daniel Wolk, and we're presenting on designing participatory discussion at the local level to counter debilitating divides, applying systemic understanding of democracy as a social form. And I think you'll hear echoes of many of the things other speakers have said in what we're talking about, an attempt that's been led by Daniel to at the local level to build democracy. And we'll be talking both about that and the theoretical framework in which we've approached it. So political and social polarization, as we've all heard, is a wicked problem that threatens democracy. So the anthropologist and systems theorist Gregory Bateson back in the 1930s coined the term schismogenesis to talk about the self-reinforcing separation of social groups that can be thought of in terms of the cybernetic idea of positive feedback leading to increasing polarization over time that can result in runaway change and social breakdown. The idea of the vicious cycle. So an example is the increasing divide between red and blue, or what's called woke and non-woke in the US, that undermines efforts at democratic deliberation. So you get this cycle of a political party or group that vilifies another party, and that party in turn vilifies the first one, and then that reinforces itself, and then you get this continuing runaway polarization. Can you?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So, and this is exemplified in what's happened with woke progressives versus Trumpian populists nationwide. And we've also seen it in the local level in Chicago, for instance, in the increasing division between people who want to, quote, defund the police and have used that slogan, and police defenders. And this paralyzes efforts to find innovative solutions to seemingly intractable social problems and undermines efforts at democratic deliberation. And nationally, there's many groups, some of you may have heard of them, like Braver Angels, Living Room Conversations, Interactivity Foundation, that have attempted to intervene in this kind of polarization. But from our point of view, the formats chosen have sometimes seemed to reinforce the divisions that they aim to heal. So our question has been, so how in practice can we disrupt the polarization and support what Larry Richards has called deep conversations? And we've also seen, as somebody earlier alluded to, the Chicago machine. Well, so what we've seen in local practice in Chicago is that the practices of campaigning have been reinforcing divisions. And interestingly enough, what we've seen on the left seems to be a replication of the old machine patterns that we used to associate more with the right, with a lack of transparency and decisions being made in back rooms that other people can't, don't have access to. So Chicago Solutions Forum is a new nonprofit that developed this fall as a local context where we can experiment by hosting and reflecting on alternate forms for talk and deliberation, for bringing citizens together in a cybernetically informed systemic design process. That is, we're going to try things out and then reflect on them and hopefully learn over time. To concentrate on local problems. So we see ourselves as somewhat different than these groups that are focusing more on discussions at the national level, national themes. We say, okay, we want, again, echoing what earlier speakers have said, we want to look at what's actually going on the ground and how we can intervene. So how we think about this, we come to this through, Daniel's done literally decades of reading that have informed this. We talk about 4 fundamental modes of social connectedness that ground individual thinking and social action, and each mode defines a type of social form or model. Anybody's interested in the references, you can talk to us afterwards.
Be about 1,000.
Yeah, literally, he said 1,000, you heard him. We can think of these things as these modes as systemic processes of local group formation and interaction with society as a whole, American society or global society, as a complex system of social forms. Real social groups and their modes of interaction are dynamic, always changing, never fit to model perfectly, but move toward or away from it. But each mode has its own characteristic vicious cycles that it can fall into. So that if group formation is characterized too purely by one mode of connection, this becomes dysfunctional. But we're positing that modes can balance or correct each other. So, and in particular, what we're trying to do, and is to counteract the social movement or mobility form with civility. And so we'll talk about that shortly. But in terms of 4 key models of social connectedness, so one that a lot of people are familiar with is the idea of community. But this has a specific definition of social interaction guided by an intuitive understanding or feeling for shared norms, expectations, what's good, what's evil, shared understandings about social status and collective goals, with the idea that out of this come individual feelings of responsibility and accountability to the group. In community, behavior is guided by what seems natural, by how social life presents itself to individuals, rather than how they represent in identity terms their social life to outsiders. So this isn't about labels for groups. It's the implicit understandings that people bring to interaction with each other, as in faith communities and families, and a range of attitudes can inform it. We usually think about mutual affection, care, trust, and support, but community also includes competitiveness in achieving respect, deference, or honor. And this contrasts with a different mode of social connectedness, usually called society, where individuals are driven by their own interests, though they can cooperate in the pursuit of interests. And the prototype for this kind of behavior is the contract that's associated with actions usually named by words like negotiate, strategize, transact, calculate, utilize, and bargain. And the extreme form, we're talking about the maximization of utility. But this is also associated with bureaucracy, which is governed by rules or algorithms. And those algorithms are connected to, they're embedded in AI, right? We've run into more and more algorithms in our contemporary life. Those who see democracy through the lens of society, you can look at democracy this way, but then you see it as a competition and balancing of interests.
I want to add a general point about these four modes of connectedness. They really do define different kinds of behavior. So the very concepts of individual versus society, culture, those are different in the four modes. And 99.9% of American social science assumes everything's society, and the other three don't apply at all. But these last two that I'm going to mention are the ones most relevant to actual democracy. So the first, rediscovering an old term, mobility, following that theme of rediscovery. At the time of the American Revolution, this is a word that they often use. It was the fuller form of the word mob. Today, you hear the word mobility, we connect it with movement. So those who have I like the term mobility because it comprehends both those who approve of this form in the form of a social movement, good social movement like civil rights, and also ones we disapprove of that we usually call mobs. So they can be good or bad. I don't think we have time for me to quote Gouverneur Morris, but he wrote the preamble to the Constitution, and he was one of many founding fathers who thought the biggest challenge of democracy was the rule of the mob. And he was really scared about that. He considered the Boston Tea Party anti-democratic. Next.
Oh, yeah, well,
Okay.
yeah.
So to define mobility in this sense, it's a coming together of people who share negative emotions. It could be based on resentment, indignation, righteous anger, outrage, sense of aggrievement, but they're motivated to act based on a shared sense of hope as well. Now, traditionally in old social theory, people talked about, crowd behavior and the madness of crowds. It doesn't have to be that, but it often is. Now, it feeds off those emotions, but it leads people to really dumb things down, okay? When people talk of slogans, talking points, they're in the mobility mode. They lose a sense of individual responsibility. You notice people who are in protest, they're not each making a sophisticated statement about why they're doing what they're doing. They all have to march in lockstep. You hear that word a lot when you try to participate in these, that expression a lot when you try to participate in these. And as I said before, the founders were terrified of these mobilities taking over. Now, in contrast, also rediscovering an old sense of a term, civility as a group, not just the idea of being civil. And so we can find that in the Oxford English Dictionary. Now, in this case, the word civil goes back to the word for city. So it's something that's more intrinsic to an urban-like environment where there's a diversity and pluralism, where there's diversity of people and pluralism. So people come from different communities. They don't share that sense that getting along in a natural way as in a community. civility is based on people actually having profound differences, and they come to discover new ways of thinking through their conversation. So as we put it here, participants join with different perspectives. Each individual has a perspective, different experience, outlooks, and ideology, and they hash out new ways of thinking and designing based on the expansion of knowledge that they produce through non-adversarial modes of conversation. Keyword dialogue, a lot of people like to call it dialogue. So our organization has explicit goal of trying to become kind of a civility to counteract the excess of mobilities in contemporary Chicago society and specifically. You see that we mentioned the defund versus defend the police. So we literally have a movement that's created a whole new set of district councils that's very hostile to the police. And the police have fought back with their mobility called the Fraternal Order of the Police. And they are trying all kinds of tricks, okay, to defeat those who take a more adversarial stand towards policing. So we've learned a few things, I hope, even in the short time that we've been trying to establish this organization, really since June or July. So we've learned that, we're trying to overcome polarization in this really toxic time. And in that context, when we call for more civil kind of discussion or dialogue, some people see that as a ploy to advocate for the interests of one side, just a trick to win in the struggle against their mobility. And for example, our first public forum was on homelessness, a proposed tax called Bring Chicago Home to provide more money for the homeless. And we posted on our Facebook page a number of articles, both for and against it. And one of the first against it was penned by Paul Vallis, who had just lost the race for mayor, but it was a very narrow defeat. He had actually been a big favorite. And so one person in particular, but he represented some others, complained that we posted it by him. And so a number of us said something. In my own words, I was one of the people who posted to explain, when we post articles or studies, this does not imply an endorsement of them. In this Facebook group, we are committed to encouraging individuals to read articles and studies and watch videos that express a wide variety of perspectives and come to their own conclusions. We posted videos of 4-hour city council meetings. So this fellow named Devlin said, declaring a fact-checking free zone is what fearmongers do. Regular readers of this Facebook group already understand it to be a safe space for alternate facts by this Vallis person. So we learned we got to establish some rules of discussion here so that we can't have somebody trolling us like this. Just declaring yourself that you're going to be civil doesn't really work. Okay, you get all kinds of accusations of virtue signaling and the like. So, but we had to do that. We have a mission statement. We had to become a nonprofit. We needed a mission statement. So you can see it there. Our mission is to upgrade the quality of public discussion of local policy problems and political issues. Some members paraphrased, some of the people in our Facebook group put it, yes, we want to elevate the quality of public discourse. And in connection with that first forum, we invited somebody from the real estate industry, somebody actually been appearing on television a lot. So this same troll, okay, who knows a lot of people, said, nominally a grassroots group under the flag of balance, Solutions Forum is exacerbating imbalance, fomenting polarization, he said too. We are honored to cast the Building Owners and Managers Association to our inaugural Elevated Discourse panel. A public appearance such as this comes from a group much more comfortable with the quiet bulk purchase of elected representatives than with grassroots activism. So you can see the toxic polarization, like we're trying to overcome that and we're being accused of just being more sophisticated polarizers. Okay, a third, a multi-sided forum striving to promote civic dialogue can be threatening. Uh, So we had trouble getting the proponents of that proposal to even show up. That's a long story in itself. Dialogue in general is a hard sell. It's a dirty word for some people. They don't believe it. They think it's very manipulative. And in our own group, some people distrust it. So we decided to separate public forums on issues with experts in a panel discussion. And then we'll follow them up, maybe about a week later, with people showing up to actually have a dialogue on them. Because people said they really needed to have more information before they go into these small group discussions. It's also, all of these depolarization groups complain it's hard to really get a good variety of positions. It's usually a big challenge to find conservatives. We've been trying very hard to make sure we're getting a wide range of opinions from woke leftists to rather conservative people. So I guess we have another minute or so left. Any case, our proposal is we really need to have more of these kinds of groups across the country. The situation is different in every locality, and we really need to experiment with different ways of achieving this kind of social form of a civility to correct the damage being done by polarizing mobilities. Now, I don't want to say that all mobilities are bad. You know, the civil rights movement under Martin Luther King was a massive mobility in this language because it brought more people into the system. So it can be very corrective for that purpose, bringing more people in, but and energizing people. In our view, the bigger problem now is not that people can't be in the system, but that, you know, we've dumbed things down. Our voters are low information voters. People just repeat the same slogans and talking points, and there's a real lack of original thinking and explore. Actually, I mean, you can say that the fundamental emotion to make civilities possible is curiosity. And there's some interesting articles in a couple of books about how curiosity is really what's lacking now.
And we need to practice it. We need to practice talking and listening to each other across divides, not just claim that we're doing that and share the results of our practice. So echoing Valerie's earlier call, I think we're asking for local experiments, but you know, like 1,000 flowers blooming, asking for people to talk to each other and share what they've found and hopefully move forward.
Thank you very much.
Oh, there's handouts available somewhere. I'm not sure where they are at the moment.
10 more minutes before the next panel, but I just wanted to mention, and this is kind of a take off on what Dan and Eve have talked about too. The next panel is about tools, methods, technologies, et cetera, that can be utilized when we're thinking about reimagining what we want our society to be like. And what even in Dan really focused on too was the need for experimentation. I think we always have to remember that when things are kind of out of balance, which is a characteristic of where we are right now, there are always these little islands of creativity, experimentation, cohesion, et cetera. Never underestimate the importance of those islands because they can lead to system change. And when we're talking about system change, when Bob gets up here and talks about it too, something that is very common to all of the tools of change that the presenters are going to be speaking about is that everybody recognizes and sees the system, not just a part of it, not a part of the system, but the entire system. They also understand that there has to be a purpose in there, a common purpose. And finally, what people are talking about are, we can't stop there with those conversations. We have to enable, we have to activate action steps to go forward. So with that, Bob. Huh? You can give your
How about running to the third panel?